in the age of wonder. Another world, another time. His land was green and good.
Ah, young one, you who know nothing of the great Edition wars of old. There was a time when Dungeons & Dragons was not streamed upon Twitch by the most beautiful of maidens. There was a time when it did not appear in television with anything like the regularity that it now does. 5th edition has ushered in a new semi-golden age, a slightly tarnished age of D&D, but prior to 5th edition there was 4th edition, which in turn succeeded 3rd edition, or more accurately 3.5 edition. 3rd edition had some issues, but they were as nothing compared to the issues of 4th edition. Now I have a signed set of 4th edition D&D, which is a bit like having Hitler's car or something similar, since 4th ed was really not a success. 3rd edition was open source in a similar way to the way that 5th edition is somewhat open source, and this led to a boom and a bust for role-playing creators. Any one third party could create anything they wanted for D&D and it would be fully compatible. This was originally their idea, but a lot of things happened that they didn't appreciate, like the Book of Erotic Fantasy, which is actually a pretty good book written by fine people. In any case, people also took all their hard work and made completely new games based off the same engine in a way that they did not appreciate, and which eventually led to Pathfinder, which is now D&D's chief rival and was outselling 4th edition for some time. 4th edition was the result of hubris, bitterness, and a well-meaning attempt to try and scratch the same itch that MMORPGs were scratching, and it failed on pretty much every count you care to measure. 4th edition D&D played like a board game, much more than a role-playing game. Certain people have always played with miniatures, but another faction has always played using what's called theatre of the mind, imagining everything and the interactions. But 4th edition very much tied you to the grid. Everything was measured in spaces, areas, and so forth, rather than in more descriptive terms. It was very much focused on pushing you onto using a board, onto using figures, and so on, in a way that really only Cadwallon or perhaps Iron Kingdoms has done, though both of those games do this better than 4th edition D&D did. They wanted to put the genie back in the box after 3rd edition, though they seem to have realised with 5th edition that this isn't something that you can do, and it's something that you should rather encourage and attempt to profit more from. So they made it much more constricted in terms of licensing, which meant that there wasn't this rush of material for it that there had been in 3rd edition, which had driven sales of the main books in 3rd edition. 4th edition didn't have that. And then Wizards of the Coast, while it's not a small company, it does not have anything like the budget, particularly in marketing, to push these games or to put the effort into them that is present in the rolling subscription model of MMORPGs, or the pay-to-win model of MMORPGs. So competing directly with computer games was playing to the weaknesses of role-playing games on the tabletop, and have very much suffered for it. Now, here's all the signatures. I won a 3-book set for winning a competition, which they were asking their former freelancers to come up with an adventure. Which I did one which was more unusual, which was a race across a city, utilising a lot of the particular rules for 4th edition. It wasn't entirely terrible. There were aspects of it that were interesting and good, but it did raise a lot of questions about why and how they set about doing things the way they did, and the eternal question, why do female dragonkin have breasts? When I wrote reviews of the game, perhaps another reason, despite my as well as my notoriety, that they haven't invited me back to do more freelancing, I criticised it for being very brown. Now what I meant, and what I actually went on to say, was that the artwork was very brown, and that the colour scheme for a lot of it, the backgrounds of the pages and so on, was very brown. The illustrations were very muddy. What people took that to mean was that I was complaining that there was too much representation of ethnic minorities in it, which isn't true at all. I think in standard D&D worlds with the high magic and the travel and so on, that through gates, teleportation and so forth, I think it makes a perfect amount of sense for there to be multi-ethnic images, descriptions, characters, for knowledge of the world to be better, people to interact with each other. It's just a more cosmopolitan world. It makes a lot more sense in a very high magic environment than it doesn't in low magic environments. As you can see here, there's all these powers listed out, and they're all very particular. You had all kinds of different abilities. One of the good things that did was to make mages more effective at low levels, because they could constantly cast low level spells and other things were restricted over time. But it did mean that every single thing you ever did was very tightly described, in a way that only magic spells had ever really been in previous editions, because that's the nature of magic. You need to know exactly what it does to interpret it effectively within your games. But here it wasn't just the magic that was tightly defined, and previously you could always use magic in rather creative and interesting ways, things like spider climb to grab hold of objects and stop them being torn from you and so forth. But in this, every power is very strictly defined, and non-magical characters are very defined. So it took away a great deal of the creativity and choice in how you went about doing things in combat. It removed that interpretation between the player and the games master. You didn't feel so much that you could pull off stunts and actions of your own devising in the way that you could in previous editions. In some ways, the less rules there are, the more open a game can be in a lot of ways. I think this is part of what's driving the old school renaissance, is the freedom that could occur between good players and good games masters in the really early editions, which didn't have rules for a lot of situations. But here it's all very tightly defined, so you're basically limited to a small handful of decisions about what powers you're going to use in what combination and effectiveness, and it very much encouraged power gaming. This was a problem in earlier editions, but 4th Ed practically made it nearly compulsory to build the right kind of build to be an effective whatever it was that you were playing. So that discouraged roleplay as well. It really tore all the advantages of tabletop roleplay out, the interplay between the games master and the player, the openness, the role-playing element, bringing it out of theatre of the mind and into miniatures is something that I feel diminishes roleplay. And it really just brought it down to the level of a skirmish board game with role-playing elements. And these are things that other things do better. There are plenty of skirmish games like Warhammer, like War Machine or Hordes, and trying to compete with those using something that has an established identity as a role-playing game just ends up pissing off your role-playing oriented base and not satisfying the people who prefer the better skirmish games. And competing with MMORPGs, which is what it was obvious that they were doing, the powers are much like the kind of click bar of special attacks and so on you get in MMOs. It was never going to compete because it's much slower, you need to be able to get together with a group face to face, and so on, and there wasn't the same emotional payoff in the role-playing. Now, I've been very negative through all of this so far, but we did manage to have a really good campaign of Dark Sun using 4th edition. The special powers and so on that non-wizarding, non-psychic characters had fit better with the setting. The more heroic / superheroic nature of characters in 4th edition and their resilience to damage and so on worked. We got rid of the board. I improvised some rules where the kind of manoeuvring powers and so on that are so important and tied to a board instead gave sort of communal tactical bonuses to attacks and so on, a pool of points you could draw on to defend yourself or to make your attacks stronger and so on, and that worked incredibly well, and we did have a rather enjoyable campaign, bringing characters up all the way from gladiators in an arena to dragon slayers at the very end of the campaign. But really, it's just... Ironically, I have a lot of the same issues with the Apocalypse engine as I do with 4th Ed, and it's really all about this narrowing of choices, the set abilities that you are given. To me, it just tears the guts out of one of the chief strengths of role-playing, which is the ability to adapt and decide and try and pull off hokey maneuvers, like strapping a donkey with oil bottles, sending it charging into the enemies, and then igniting it with a flaming arrow. You know, if your power doesn't say that you can do that, it becomes very hard in this case, and almost discouraged, for a games master to interpret what would happen in such a circumstance, whereas earlier editions encourage and make easier that level of improvisation. I mean, it's just text and text and text, and so much of this is powers. You don't really get a strong sense of a world from it. That said, there were things that it did well. The idea of rituals, which was magic that non-magical characters could do, but which took a long time. That was good. The idea of extended challenges, where you make multiple rolls over time to accomplish a long-winded task. That was very good, and something worth importing to other systems. It was also obsessed with balance. I guess the opposite extreme would be Palladium games, where character types aren't balanced at all, but here every character felt like it was the same in some ways, and it became harder and harder, especially as they rose in level, to differentiate between the character types and what they could do. I mean, overall, 4th edition, I think, was a disaster, in exactly the same way that 3rd edition wasn't. 3rd edition was great for the role-playing industry, but maybe not as good for Wizards of the Coast themselves. But they certainly seem to have gone back slightly in terms of attitude, rules, and the emphasis with 5th edition, which has made it much better and much more open than this travesty. Zang.